In early 1945, World War II was entering its final phase. In Europe, Nazi Germany was on the brink of collapse. But in the Pacific, the fighting remained fierce, and the gateway into the heart of Japan was slowly opening. After bloody victories at Iwo Jima and in the Philippines, the U.S. High Command set its next target, Okinawa, the largest island of the Ryukyu chain, lying less than 600 kilometers from Japan's main islands. This would be the strategic springboard for the invasion of the Japanese homeland, where airfields and ports could directly support the planned landings on Kyushu. For Tokyo, Okinawa was a lifeline. For the first time in the war, Japanese territory, even if peripheral, was facing a direct, large-scale assault. If it fell, the road to the main islands would be wide open. Determined to prevent that, the Imperial Japanese Army turned Okinawa into a fortress to the death, where more than 100,000 troops of the 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima were prepared to fight to the last man. Tens of thousands of civilians, including women and school children, were mobilized to serve in logistics or even take up arms, making this battle a bloodbath with no clear line between front and rear. The United States codenamed the operation to capture Okinawa Iceberg and prepared for the largest amphibious assault in the history of the Pacific Theater. The U.S. 10th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., worked in conjunction with Admiral Raymond Spruance's powerful Fifth Fleet, mobilizing 184,000 troops and over 1,500 warships. In the days leading up to the landing, the American fleet unleashed a steel storm on the island, but most of Japan's underground tunnels and fortifications remained intact. Learning from previous defeats, Ushijima abandoned the suicidal Banzai counterattacks and instead adopted a war of attrition strategy designed by Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. Rather than defending the beaches, Japanese forces pulled back to the southern part of Okinawa, using the mountainous terrain around the former capital of Shuri to build a multi-layered defensive line. Inside concrete bunkers and interconnected caves, they waited for the Americans to advance into their killing zones before unleashing concentrated fire, inflicting maximum casualties, and retreating back into the tunnels. The Battle of Okinawa was thus destined to be one of the bloodiest and most brutal clashes of World War II, where every inch of ground would be paid for in blood, and both sides knew whoever prevailed here would hold the key to ending the war. On the morning of April 1st, 1945, coinciding with Easter Sunday and, ironically, April Fool's Day, the landing operation on Okinawa officially began. Hundreds of U.S. landing craft surged toward Hagushi Beach on the island's western shore, under intense covering fire from naval guns and aircraft. The Allied troops stepped into the water expecting to face fierce resistance the moment they set foot on land. But to everyone's astonishment, not a single Japanese soldier was waiting. Thousands of American troops crossed the beach unscathed, encountering only a few frightened civilians hiding in houses and shelters. The silence was so uncanny that Admiral Raymond Spruance remarked, "Perhaps the Japanese have given up," to which Admiral Chester Nimitz jokingly replied, "Leave out the word perhaps." In reality, exactly as planned, General Mitsuru Ushijima had ordered his forces to remain still, allowing the Americans to advance inland straight into the death trap prepared in the south. By the end of L-Day, roughly 60,000 U.S. troops had landed successfully and established a solid beachhead. In the days that followed, they rapidly expanded their control, seizing the strategic Yantan and Kadena airfields, and within just 4 days cutting across the island to the eastern shore, a mission the U.S. command had originally estimated would take 3 weeks. The American flag flew over the newly captured airfields, signaling a promising start. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner immediately moved to the next phase, sending the 6th Marine Division north to clean out the remainder of the island, while directing the Army's 7th and 96th Divisions south toward Shuri, which he believed housed the enemy's headquarters. Northern Okinawa was only lightly defended, mainly by the Japanese 44th Independent Regiment entrenched on the Motobu Peninsula in scattered caves. After about 2 weeks of fighting, they were wiped out by the Marines. By April 18, 1945, the entire northern half of the island was under Allied control, with fewer than 1,000 U.S. casualties. However, this victory was merely the calm before the storm. In the south, around the Shuri-Naha area, the Japanese had concentrated their full strength into a multi-layered, heavily fortified defense line, setting the stage for the decisive battlefield of the Okinawa campaign. When U.S. forces began pushing into southern Okinawa, the true nightmare began. On April 4, 1945, the spearhead of the U.S. Army suddenly ran into fierce fire from elevated positions ahead, the forward line of Japanese defenses known as the Machinato Line. Japanese artillery and mortars poured down from the hillsides, while machine guns hidden in bunkers on both flanks swept across the advancing troops, forcing American infantry to hug the ground. At Hacksaw Ridge, on the western flank of the Shuri line, the opening clash of a bloody struggle erupted. Groups of U.S. soldiers trying to climb the slopes were thrown back by invisible bursts of fire from positions hidden deep within the caves. Tanks moving up in support blundered into ambushes. Bogged down or blown apart by mines, they were quickly assaulted by Japanese infantry crawling out of underground tunnels to destroy them with explosives or grenades. Interconnected caves and cliffs of Kamikaze formed a deadly maze, allowing Japanese troops to move unseen beneath the ground and suddenly appear behind enemy lines. For days, American forces launched one assault after another, only to be driven back by tenacious defenders. In the end, the first attempt to break the Shuri line had to be called off, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across slopes bristling with enemy fortifications. But Kamikaze was only the beginning. Throughout April 1945, the fight for every hill and every yard of trench raged around the northern approaches to Shuri. Positions with deceptively romantic code names became symbols of hell on earth: Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe, Half Moon, and Conical Hill. Each ridge and cave might change hands multiple times in a single day. Many American soldiers, after enduring hours of unrelenting combat, suffered complete mental collapse or broke down in the field under the unprecedented intensity of Okinawa's battle. By May, the weather worsened the misery. Torrential rains turned the battlefield into a sucking morass. Soldiers on both sides lay in foul, stinking mud mixed with blood and the bodies of comrades, continuing the fight in conditions where life and death seemed indistinguishable. Amid this carnage, a rare act of courage offered a flicker of hope. On April 26, 1945, at Maida Escarpment, known as Hacksaw Ridge, U.S. troops launched a decisive assault on a cluster of Japanese-held heights. The battle inflicted horrific casualties on both sides. In the midst of the gunfire, U.S. Army medic Desmond Doss achieved the impossible. Without carrying a weapon, he crawled through the mud for 12 hours, one by one dragging 75 wounded comrades to the cliff's edge and lowering them by rope to safety below. That selfless act would later earn Doss the Medal of Honor and become the centerpiece of the acclaimed film Hacksaw Ridge. But in that moment, on the cold, windswept heights of Maida, he was simply a small beacon of light in the blood-soaked, desperate landscape of Okinawa. The fighting around Okinawa was not confined to the land. The skies and surrounding seas also became scenes of brutal combat. From the moment U.S. troops set foot on the island, Japan unleashed its most fearsome weapon, the kamikaze suicide attack. On the afternoon of April 6, 1945, More than 300 suicide planes took off from the Japanese mainland, diving en masse toward the Allied fleet encircling Okinawa. This was the first wave of 10 kikusui, floating chrysanthemum attacks, launched during the campaign. The bomb-laden planes struck U.S. warships like giant fireballs. Destroyers stationed on the outer defensive screen bore the brunt. Many were set ablaze, and some sank instantly. The following day, April 7th, the Imperial Japanese Navy gambled everything in Operation Tengo, hoping to turn the tide. At its core was the legendary super battleship Yamato, accompanied by a cruiser and 8 destroyers. The mission was, in essence, a suicide run. The ships carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip, intending to beach themselves near Okinawa and use Yamato's massive 460mm guns to fire directly on U.S. forces ashore. But the plan quickly unraveled. That morning, the Japanese task force was spotted mid-route by an American submarine. By midday, more than 380 aircraft from U.S. carriers swarmed in, unleashing a torrent of bombs and torpedoes. After over 2 hours of hopeless resistance, Yamato was struck repeatedly, exploded violently, and sank, taking about 3,000 crew members, including Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, to the bottom. The cruiser Yahagi and most of the escorting destroyers were also sunk, with only 3 crippled destroyers making it back to Japan. From that point, the Imperial Japanese Navy was effectively finished. Even without its main fleet, Japan did not halt the airborne onslaught. For weeks, wave after wave of kamikazes slammed into the U.S. fleet offshore. The U.S. Fifth Fleet suffered unprecedented losses, 36 warships sunk and roughly 368 others damaged to varying degrees. Even large aircraft carriers were not safe, notably the USS Bunker Hill, which was struck by 2 suicide planes in quick succession one morning, killing nearly 400 sailors and putting the carrier out of action. American sailors described the horror of the kamikaze raids as hell raining down from the sky. In total, Japan used over 1,400 suicide pilots in the Battle of Okinawa, killing around 4,900 Allied personnel, mostly sailors, and wounding nearly 5,000 more. The U.S. Navy's losses accounted for nearly 1/3 of all Allied fatalities in Okinawa, a figure that stunned the Allied High Command. Admiral Chester Nimitz bitterly remarked, "We are losing an average of a ship and a half every day during the prolonged anchorage under relentless suicide attacks." This grim reality put immense pressure on General Buckner on land to accelerate the destruction of Japanese forces before the fleet offshore was worn down to breaking point. In southern Okinawa, after weeks of relentless assaults, U.S. forces gradually wore down and breached sections of the Japanese defensive lines. On April 20th, 1945, the forward Makanato line was destroyed following bloody battles at Kakazu and the surrounding area. But this was still not the final objective. Ahead lay the main defensive belt encircling Shuri Castle, the most fortified stronghold and the primary Japanese command center on the island. To break through this steel shell, General Simon Buckner changed tactics. He withdrew the exhausted Army divisions from the main axis of attack and replaced them with the battle-hardened 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. From early May 1945, the Marines launched new offensives against the western flank of Shuri, focusing on the outlying strong points of Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe, and Half Moon Hill. The fighting here was ferocious. For nearly a week, U.S. Marines fought in continuous close combat under heavy fire before capturing these critical heights, wiping out most of the Japanese regiment defending Shuri's western flank. The cost, however, was staggering. At Sugarloaf Hill alone, about 2,000 U.S. casualties were suffered in just a few days, with an entire Marine regiment virtually wiped out and forced to withdraw for reorganization. Facing the threat of a breakthrough, during the night of May 3rd to 4th, 1945, General Mitsuru Ushijima committed his reserve forces in a full-scale counterattack. Thousands of Japanese soldiers surged forward in the dark, attempting to drive U.S. forces from the high ground around Shuri. Simultaneously, a special attack unit in rubber boats tried to slip out to sea and land behind U.S. lines to strike Yantan airfield. The plan collapsed completely. On land, Japanese infantry were crushed by overwhelming U.S. firepower, and at sea, the raiding party was detected by radar and almost entirely destroyed offshore. Within a matter of days, Japan lost an estimated 6,000 elite troops. Morale within the Japanese ranks began to falter. By mid-May, the American encirclement of Shuri was tightening. From both west and east, U.S. forces were only a few hundred meters from the walls. On May 25th, the battleship USS Mississippi fired directly at Shuri Castle's main tower, turning the symbol of Japanese authority into an inferno. On the night of May 21st, in the underground command bunker beneath the castle, Ushijima met with his senior officers. Chief of Staff Isamu Cho pressed to fight to the end, but most argued for a withdrawal to preserve forces for a final stand. Ushijima agreed. Over the following nights, small groups of Japanese troops quietly slipped away toward the island's southern tip, using mountain paths under the cover of darkness. U.S. forces initially did not notice, only realizing the withdrawal when scouts reported columns of men in white clothing, civilian garb, moving out of Shuri at night. Determined not to let the prey escape, the Americans launched an all-out assault. On May 29, 1945, the flag of the U.S. 1st Marine Division was raised over the ruins of Shuri Castle. The most formidable Japanese defensive position on Okinawa had fallen. It marked the collapse of the last symbol of Imperial Japan's pride on the island. Even after Shuri had fallen, the battle was not over. Around 30,000 remnants of the Japanese army withdrew to the Kian Peninsula, a rugged, hilly area at the island's southern tip, their last defensive position. With little heavy weaponry left, they fought on with whatever they had. Many soldiers, once out of ammunition, charged directly at U.S. troops in hand-to-hand combat with samurai swords or bayonets, turning the final clashes into a chaotic bloodbath. In the air, though nearly out of planes, the Japanese sent out a few outdated aircraft for final suicide missions, with some pilots even diving into formations of American tanks. On the ground, U.S. forces advanced while repeatedly broadcasting surrender appeals over loudspeakers, but most Japanese soldiers ignored them, choosing to fight to the death. On June 18, 1945, with the battle's outcome already clear, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, the overall U.S. commander on Okinawa, was killed by artillery fire while inspecting the front lines, making him the highest-ranking U.S. officer to die from enemy fire in all of World War II. The very next day, Brigadier General Claudius M. Easley was also killed on the Southern Front. These losses only strengthened the American resolve to end the battle swiftly. On the evening of June 21, 1945, the U.S. flag was raised over Kitano Point, the southernmost tip of Okinawa. The Japanese guns had all but fallen silent. Ushijima's defensive force was destroyed or scattered. At dawn on June 22, 1945, knowing they could no longer hold out, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and Chief of Staff Isamu Cho performed seppuku on a cliff, taking their command swords with them so they would not fall into enemy hands. Their deaths marked the complete end of all organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The 82-day battle, a hell of blood and fire, had finally come to an end. Okinawa had fallen. The Battle of Okinawa has been called the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, and that is no exaggeration when looking at the casualty figures. Japan was almost entirely wiped out on the island. Around 100,000 to 110,000 soldiers were killed, and fewer than 7,500 were taken prisoner, most of them badly wounded or exhausted. The vast majority fought to the death or committed suicide rather than surrender. The civilians of Okinawa also endured an unprecedented tragedy. At least 40,000 and possibly more than 100,000 were killed. Convinced by propaganda that American troops would torture them if captured, many families chose mass suicide. Some clutched grenades to kill themselves, leapt from cliffs into the sea, or used knives and ropes to end their own lives and those of their loved ones. For this reason, Okinawa in 1945 was not just a battle, but a humanitarian catastrophe deeply etched into Japan's memory. For the Allies, victory also came at a terrible cost. Over 12,000 Americans, some sources say as many as 14,000, were killed, including Army, Marine Corps, and Navy personnel. Among them were General Simon Buckner and famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was killed on April 18th on the island of Ieshima near Okinawa. About 35,000 to 36,000 other Americans were wounded. For the U.S. Navy in particular, the damage inflicted by kamikaze attacks was immense. Roughly 4,900 sailors were killed, and dozens of warships were sunk or heavily damaged. U.S. casualties at Okinawa even exceeded the combined total of the Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal battles, leaving many American commanders stunned. Beyond the loss of life, Okinawa left deep psychological scars. It recorded the highest number of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD cases, among surviving American troops of any battle in World War II. With Okinawa in hand, the U.S. now possessed an ideal forward base for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. However, the staggering losses there alarmed Washington. Reports to President Harry S. Truman predicted that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost millions of lives. Japan had already shown its willingness to fight to the last man, even arming civilians. Faced with this prospect, Truman chose another course, the Manhattan Project. On July 26, 1945, the U.S. and its allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's surrender or face complete destruction. When Japan ignored the warning, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th, alongside the Soviet Union's campaign in Manchuria. Cornered, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, officially ending World War II. Okinawa marked the end of Japan's resistance in the Pacific. The 82-day bloodbath not only annihilated Japan's last major fighting force in the region, but also shaped how the war would end, leading the U.S. to choose the atomic bomb over the gamble of an invasion. The sacrifices at Okinawa remain a lasting reminder to future generations of the ultimate horrors of war.